Okay, hi everybody. Again, I apologize for being a little bit late. And I hope everyone had a wonderful Tu B'Shvat, an inspiring Tu B'Shvat. And it is brought down that just as Tu B'Shvat is the new year of the trees, a human being is also an inverted tree whose roots are in heaven. And as a result, the equivalent of the sap that goes up in the trees are the spiritual influences that go down into us. So as a result, Tu B'Shvat is a time of renewal, of the rediscovery of potentialities that we were not aware that we had. So Be'ezrat Hashem, I hope that all of us should experience a sense of hischadshut, of renewal and growth after this Rosh Hashanah of Ilanot, of trees. Today we are moving to topic 2 of the book of Exodus. You will recall that the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, essentially has 3 topics with some digressions in the middle, some very significant digressions, like the sin of the golden calf. But in terms of the forward trajectory, we have Yetziat Mitzrayim, we have the Exodus, and then we have the receiving of the Torah, and then we have the building of the sanctuary that brings God into our hearts and in our souls. We have concluded for now the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we are now moving to the receiving of the Torah. It's worthy to ponder just for a moment the relationship between those 2 events. Basically, the lesson of the linkage of Yetziat Mitzrayim and Matan Torah is the notion that freedom as a value has no significance unless it is linked to the assumption of some noble goal. Freedom from something is not a purpose of life. One cannot say, for example, the purpose of my life is to be free. That is a nonsensical statement unless one defines what is it that you want to accomplish by your freedom. That is why the holidays of Pesach are linked with Shavuos via the ceremony, the counting of the Omer, because a Pesach without a Shavuos, without a Kabbalah HaTorah, without a receiving of the Torah, is fundamentally meaningless. That is why the Gemara tells us, for example, that the grain offering that was brought on Pesach is a barley offering, and the grain offering that is brought on Shavuos is a wheat offering. Barley, at least before the invention of cholent, was primarily animal fodder, and therefore freedom that is not linked to Torah is simply animal liberation. It is the Torah that is a human, it turns animal liberation into human dignity and human freedom. This is quite an important message, even from a secular standpoint, that people have to understand that freedom must be connected to responsibility. Freedom must be connected to commitments. If it's simply a question of not being bound by anything, it does not have any content. Not only does it lack content, but it becomes destructive. I've quoted more than once the beautiful analogy, the beautiful metaphor that the Indian poet Tagore uses, in which a human soul is like a violin string, capable of producing the most exquisite music, but only when it's tied down across the bridge. Take a loose string that's totally free, totally unencumbered. What will you get out of it? You will get nothing out of it. And therefore we understand that freedom is a beautiful thing, because freedom is often the indispensable condition to achieve self-actualization. But you have to have a self-actualization. There has to be a self that you have to actualize. Just to be free is essentially meaningless. So as a result, therefore, there was always a linkage in Judaism between the season of freedom and the season of commitment, which is Matan Torah. And that is why, interestingly enough, the rabbinic name for the holiday of Shavuos, the rabbinic name, it's not the Torah's name, is called Atzeret. When Chazal say the word Atzeret, they do not mean Shmini Atzeret. They mean the holiday of Shavuot. Now Atzeret literally means conclusion, like a stop sign, Atzor, stop, conclude, don't go further. Because Atzeret is regarded as the conclusion of the holiday of Pesach. In fact, Ramban actually says that you could visualize the counting of the Omer as one long Chol HaMoed linking a single holiday, Pesach Shavuos. Now be careful about that. If you tell your boss you don't work during Chol HaMoed and you decide to take off all of the days between Pesach and Shavuos, the job will probably not be waiting for you. So be careful not to take it too literally. But spiritually, the counting of the Omer is that link between freedom and responsibility that is so important. Now we know, of course, that, what's the story? Everyone, often a Jew will say, well, I'm not that religious, but I keep the 10 Commandments, which will, of course, appear in this parsha. So Rabbi Emanuel Feldman, who was a rabbi in Atlanta for many, many years, almost actually one of the legendary Orthodox American rabbis, he now lives in Israel. His oldest son is his successor. He tells the story. He writes about life in the rabbinate over 50 years, and much of his congregation for a lot of the time were not halachically observant, but he was trying to run an Orthodox synagogue and bring them to Yiddishkeit. So he tells the story that there was a woman who used to just show up at his office, and she loved to talk. And he accommodated her because she was a nice woman, but often she would come at very bad times when he was very, very busy, overwhelmed with work. And she always had the same line. She said, "Rabbi, I'm not as religious as you, but I do keep the 10 Commandments." And normally he would nod and he would smile, but one day he was a little irritated. So he said, "Oh yeah? What about the fourth one?" So it happens to be the fourth commandment is remember the day of Shabbos to keep it holy. So she said, "Which one is that?" So he said, "Keep the Shabbat day. Do you keep the Shabbat day?" So she said, "Oh, I didn't know that was there." So the truth of the matter is, when people say they keep the 10 Commandments, they actually mean they keep the 5 Commandments. They keep the last 5. I don't kill, I don't steal, I don't commit adultery, I don't covet, although that's a hard one. It's not to be judged, but probably most of us do covet, even religious Jews. But the first ones are theological, keeping the Shabbat, believing in God. So the 10 Commandments are considered to be very, very important. They are the only commandments that were given to the Jewish people directly from God, with miracles and thunder and lightning, and the rest of the Torah was given to Moshe privately to be communicated to us. But Chazal were afraid of this attitude. Chazal were actually afraid that people might overemphasize the 10 Commandments, because it mentions that there used to be a minhag in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, that the 10 Commandments would be recited every day, publicly, and the sages discontinued that custom. So people shouldn't say this is the only part of the Torah that is binding. Exactly that attitude. They actually discontinued the saying. Based on that, there's a very interesting responsum of the Rambam. It's not in the Rambam's halachic book. It's like a private letter that he wrote. Many people have a custom, it probably is the most common custom, that when we read the 10 Commandments in Shul, this Shabbos, we will stand up, meaning even if you sit down for the Torah reading, some people stand up for the whole Torah reading, but even those who sit down, they rise for the Aseret HaDibrot, in honor of the giving of the Torah. So Maimonides actually writes he is not in favor of that custom, because the same way Chazal abolished the public reading of the 10 Commandments in the Beit HaMikdash, so that people shouldn't have the attitude, this part of the Torah is more important than that part of the Torah, Maimonides said the same objection might apply to standing up for this part of the Torah when you don't stand up for that part of the Torah. So Maimonides actually wrote people either should stand for everything or sit for everything. You don't preferentially designate certain parts of the Torah as more significant. Nevertheless, in spite of Maimonides' argument and the logic of his position, the prevailing custom is, I do believe, that people do stand up for their Aseret HaDibrot. Right, so some people stand up a few verses beforehand in order that they're not just favoring those particular verses. And Rav Moshe Feinstein does have a responsum where he defends the prevailing minhag. And again, I want to point out that the Rambam does not give that as a halachic ruling in his Mishnah Torah, so maybe it was just more of a suggestion rather than a definitive psak halacha. Although that's an interesting, again, this is not our subject tonight at all. The Rambam wrote his code, as well as the Guide to the Perplexed and the commentary to the Mishnah, but he also wrote many responsa. And in the responsa, there are halachot that are not in his code, and it's an interesting issue. Why didn't he incorporate psakim from his tshuvot into the code? And here, there's actually an interesting idea that the only thing the Rambam codified in his code are laws that have direct sources in the Babylonian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud. Any law which is just a matter of his own logic, he did not incorporate in the code of the Mishnah Torah itself. So that's an interesting methodological issue. Okay. Now, we know, if you look in many Sidurim, there's a list of 6 remembrances, Sheish Zechirot. 6 ideas, some expanded to 10, that you're supposed to remember every day. Remember the Exodus, etc. Remember the Shabbos, even every day you think about Shabbos. So one of the things that you're supposed to remember every day is the standing at Mount Sinai to get the Torah. That one should literally visualize every day. That Ma'amad, that great assembly, where God gave us the 10 Commandments, and by extension the rest of the Torah as well, although we didn't get the commandments, but essentially the 10 Commandments are the root and the foundation of all the other commandments. And this corresponds to what Chazal say, that the Torah should be new in our eyes every single day. We shouldn't kind of, I put on tefillin today because I did it yesterday. The same way when you eat breakfast, right? You don't say, I'm eating breakfast today because I did it yesterday and the day before. No, I'm eating it because I'm hungry now. So too with Torah, there needs to be that type of excitement. As a result, therefore, it would be instructive to examine the steps that the Jewish people took to prepare for the Torah then, because that would be relevant to how we prepare for the Torah now, because we are supposed to be reliving that experience. So I want to share with you mainly a very, very interesting, beautiful comment, a long comment of the Or HaChaim HaKadosh. Or HaChaim, the light of life, is the great commentary on the Chumash, written by Rav Chaim ben Attar. Rav Chaim ben Attar was around 250 years ago. He was a rabbi from Morocco who came to Eretz Yisrael, and he is buried on Har HaZeisim, the Mount of Olives, and his yahrzeit is in the month of Tammuz. I think it's the 15th or the 16th, one of those 2 days. I don't remember. I think it's the 16th of Tammuz. And you may know that every year on his yahrzeit, thousands and thousands of people come to the Or HaChaim's kever. He was considered to be a great, great tzaddik, a makubal, and the like. And he focuses on the following. And here we have to have a relatively close reading. In the beginning of Matan Torah, it says, B'chodesh HaShlishi, on the 3rd month, counting from Nisan Iyar Sivan, Lotzeis B'nei Yisrael Me'eretz Mitzrayim, from the time that they left Mitzrayim, they left in Nisan, so the 3rd month would be Nisan Iyar Sivan. On Rosh Chodesh Sivan, they came to Midbar Sinai, they came to the Sinai desert. That is Pasuk Aleph. Pasuk Beis then seems to go backwards. Vayisu mir-Refidim. They left the oasis of Refidim. Vayavo Midbar Sinai. They came to the Sinai desert. Vayachanu b'Midbar, and they encamped in the desert. Vayichan Sham Yisrael neged Har, and they encamped next to the mountain, next to Mount Sinai. So the Or HaChaim ponders, what information is the 2nd verse giving me that I don't already know from the 1st verse? Because here's the thing. At the end of Parshas Beshalach, we are told that the Jewish people were in the oasis of Refidim. That's where Amalek attacked them. And in Pasuk Aleph, I just read, it says they came to Sinai. So, by comparing the end of last week's Parsha with this week's Parsha, we know they left Refidim, they came to Sinai. So what is the purpose? After you've told me in the 1st verse they came to Sinai, what's the purpose of then going backwards, and they left Refidim, and they came to Sinai, the Sinai desert, and they encamped in the Sinai desert, right? And then again it repeats they encamped. In other words, Pasuk Beis is totally superfluous in light of the information we already know. The only thing Pasuk Beis seems to be telling me is they left Refidim, they came to Sinai. Well, I know from Beshalach they were in Refidim, and I know from Pasuk Aleph they came to Sinai. So what is the purpose of Pasuk Beis there? So here is what the Orach Chaim tells us. The Orach Chaim tells us that Pasuk Beis is not referring to the geographical journey that the Jewish people took. That I know. Geographically, they left Refidim and they came to Sinai. But rather, it's metaphorically describing the spiritual journey that one takes as one becomes ready to accept God's Torah. And it's really a 4-step plan. So you just put these 4 steps into action. Much easier said than done, for sure. But this 4-step plan will mean you become a person that is ready to accept God's Torah. Step 1, and we're just going to take the different phrases in Pasuk Beis. Vayisu mirfidim. You must leave what is called Refidim. Now, what is Refidim? Now, well, Refidim is an oasis. It is the place where the Jewish people were. It is the place where Amalek attacked us. They were the very first nation that attacked us after we left Mitzrayim, and Amalek was defeated. But Chazal say Refidim has a double meaning. Why did Amalek attack us in a place that happens to be called Refidim? Because Refidim also exemplifies a certain attitude. Rafidim is an abbreviation or a contraction of Rafu Yadayim. Their hands were weak from the Torah. Now, what does it mean hands are weak? This is an idiomatic expression. Let's imagine that you're crossing a busy street and you're holding your baby in your arms. You will hold the baby very tight because, God forbid, you don't want to trip or drop the baby if the baby squirms. So things you care about, you tend to hold very tightly. Now, let's imagine at the same time you're just holding some tissue in your hand, even if you're not a litterer, you don't deliberately litter, but you might be holding it relatively loosely. If it blows out of your hand, you don't really care that much. It doesn't really make a big difference. So the phrase, their hands are loose, refers to a certain attitude in life in which my relationship to Torah, of course Torah wasn't given yet, but it means the relationship to God, is something I don't take very seriously. I lack passion. I lack excitement. I lack enthusiasm. Even if I keep the commandments, I do them by rote. I do them mechanically. I do them superficially. So the first step to truly accepting God's Torah is leave the world of Refidim and embrace Torah with passion and excitement and enthusiasm. Indeed, Chazal say, Amalek attacks us when we are in a state of Refidim, when we are in a state of coldness, indifference, sometimes even hostility. That is exactly when Amalek has its entree. And in order to be freed from Amalek and in order to embrace God's Torah, we need an atmosphere and a feeling of leaving Refidim. That's Vayisu Refidim. This is a very important point. Indeed, it's one of the hidden problems of the religious world. Obviously not everybody, but many people in the religious world, even if people are they're religious. They go through the motions. They do everything right. But in some ways, they are what you might call, I don't want to say they, because I think all of us suffer from it, and I suffer from it too, in different ways. The living dead. Feeding our souls. We don't get joy, we don't get enthusiasm. How do we get it? That's a hard thing. That's not easy to do, especially since so much of Judaism is in fact repetitive, right? We daven the same things every day. We do the same things quite a lot. And it's hard sometimes to have a sense of renewal. I'll confess, I sometimes see, not recently and not often certainly, but I sometimes see, these Christian revivalist shows. I shouldn't really say this. They're dancing around and excited and so passionate. And I say, wow, why can't we have a show like that? Now the truth is, maybe if I lived in Achnai, maybe I would see it. We have Neo Chasidus, we have Karlbach Minyanim. Now it's true that the Baal HaTanya was very suspicious of overly emotional Judaism, because he felt, even though he was a Chesed, that's why Chabad is a Hasidus based on the intellect. He felt that emotional excitement is very ephemeral. It's very temporary. It kind of comes and it goes, and it doesn't last. It has to be linked to something more enduring, more introspective. He was very suspicious. That's why, in fact, he was almost the least Hasidic of early Hasidic masters. People don't realize the Alter Rebbe was not only in trouble with the Misnagdim. The Alter Rebbe was in great trouble with other Hasidic groups, because his path was kind of a combination of both. So I'm not taking sides on this. I'm not advocating, pure emotionalism. I certainly understand how that can be superficial, and that doesn't really change a person. But passion, look at the Rambam. We would look at the Rambam is the epitome of rationalism, right? The Rambam was not somebody who probably danced around at a Karlbach minyan. The Rambam always talks about the mind, and yet, you see, when the Rambam describes contemplating a God, loving God, he actually says that loving God means you cannot take your mind off Hashem, and he uses imagery which is, we would call, quite risque. It's like a man that is lovesick with feelings towards a woman that he cannot stop thinking of. That's exactly what the Rambam says, vis-a-vis the idea of how you love God. So the Rambam actually had a tremendous passion that came from the intellect itself. It's something that's a little foreign to us in many ways, because we separate emotionality and intellectualism, when in fact for the Rambam the intellectualism itself was the great adventure. It was an ecstatic excitement. It was linking to a cosmic intelligence, the infinity of God. Be it as it may, each person has to find their own way. But the point is, we need a Judaism of enthusiasm, of joy, of passion, not simply following rules in a mechanical, superficial way. So that is step one. You want to accept God's Torah? Leave the attitude of Rafu Yedehem min HaTorah and embrace the Torah with passion. Okay. Step two. It says they came to the Midbar. Right? They came to the Sinai desert. So here the Orach Chaim points out that desert has a very interesting connotation. A desert is relatively empty. In fact, there are photographers who actually find deserts extraordinarily beautiful because they're not cluttered with stuff. You don't have, at least in a pure desert, you don't have a lot of buildings, you don't even have a lot of trees. The very emptiness of the desert gives it a certain pristine quality. See, here what the Orach Chaim says, an interesting point. The second step of Matan Torah is to declutter your life and free yourself from over-dependence on material possessions. Now we know that Judaism is not ascetic. Judaism does not say fast, take a vow of poverty, sleep on a bed of nails, be celibate. All of that is not true. Mitzvah to get married, one is supposed to have a nice home and build a family, and one is supposed to enjoy the world. In fact, we just had Tu B'Shvat. One of the teachings that is often quoted on Tu B'Shvat is the teaching of the Talmud Yerushalmi, that a person will be called to account for every pleasure of the world they could have indulged in, and they didn't, because God put those pleasures in. So we should get joy and appreciation. So we're not talking about renunciation, we're not talking about a hair shirt, we're not talking about eating dry bread and water. Enjoy life. But we do understand fundamentally that the more invested you are in stuff, the less room there is to connect to God. And the reason that's so is because material pleasures are instant gratification. And spiritual pleasures take work. So the same way that in internet culture, where we're used to web surfing and flipping from one thing to another, so it's very difficult to read Shakespeare or read Dickens, I'm using secular analogies, because when you're habituated to the instant gratification, you can't put in the time and the effort for something that's more sustained. Or the same way that the person who lives off junk food is not going to spend 3.5 hours to make a beautiful French meal or whatever it would be. Because the instant takes away the willingness to work for something greater. So too, generally, when you're connected to the physical pleasures of the world, which give you an instant gratification, we are unwilling to invest the time and the effort in matters of the mind and matters of the spirit that require work. So you gotta declutter, the Orach Chaim says. That's the idea of desert. Come to the desert, simplify. Get rid of the stuff that's unnecessary. And of course, I would add to the Orach Chaim, he doesn't say this directly, that decluttering may have a secondary meaning as well. On one hand, it may mean getting rid of the stuff that you don't need, but that can also refer to all the psychological baggage that we carry. We carry in our hearts and in our minds resentments, grudges, angers. They really kind of clutter things up. They take up a lot of space in our mind, and they don't even pay rent. Right? They live rent-free in our brains. And part of it is decluttering. It's interesting that there was a competitive cyclist. I heard the story once. A person who had been doing bicycle races, Tour de France, all of that stuff, and he became a Shomer Shabbos. So he had to stop racing because the races were over the weekends. So he had to give up those races. So he was asked, was it difficult for you to give up the races, or how do you find being a Shomer Shabbos? So he said, no. Shabbos is very much like my competitive bicycle race. What's going on? Because when you have racers who are just like an Olympic game as well, they're very, very high level of competition. The difference between the winner and the next place is maybe fractions of a second. Right, in swimming, right? The difference might be a tenth, you wouldn't even know. You have to have special measuring devices, 1/10 of a second, 100th of a second, and the like. So when you're doing your bicycle, and some guy is like, a 1/4 of an inch or less behind you, so you have to start getting rid of all the things that are slowing you up. You get rid of your cap, you get rid of your scarf, because those little things make a difference. Olympic swimmers, shave their body hair, because the little hair on the arm might slow them up a tiny little bit. So, he said, competitive cycling taught me to get rid of the stuff you don't need in life. And that's what a Jew is too. Get rid of the unnecessary baggage. So, as a result, competitive cycling and being Shomer Shabbos are kind of the same type of process. Embrace what's helpful and pushes you forward. Get rid of the stuff that's holding you back. That's an important lesson in life, and that's the second step. Coming to the desert. Right? First step is leaving Refidim, passion. Second step is coming to the desert. Unclutter yourself, simplify. And now the third also says desert. So desert does double duty, because it says, and they encamped in the desert. Right? So desert is mentioned twice in this verse. And here, the Orach Chaim says, desert has another connotation. On one level, it is simplicity and disengagement with possessions. But the fact that the desert is so empty is kind of a humility. There's a humbling about it. It's not pretentious. It's not arrogant. It just is there. And that is the third quality for Matan Torah. And that is the quality of humility. Not to be arrogant. Now it's interesting that here we have mixed metaphors. The Orach Chaim reads humility in the desert, use of the word desert. And yet we have other rabbinic teachings that use humility in the message of water. Torah is compared to water, just as water leaves the high ground and it goes to the low ground. Torah leaves the arrogant and goes to the humble. So it's interesting that the metaphor for humility almost employs two opposite ideas. It uses the metaphor of water, and it uses the metaphor of desert, which is a simple, unpretentious place. Why is humility so important? Well, on the most simple level, Humility is important because it is only humility that enables me to learn. Because when I'm arrogant, number one, I think I'm right, and there's nothing you can teach me. And number two, I'm also never going to admit any gap in my knowledge, because that would make me look bad, or whatever it would be. Again, arrogance, it can actually be connected to insecurity. That's a whole other psychological profile. But be it as it may, when a person is humble, they're open to learn, they're open to grow, they're open to hear God's voice, even if that challenges their preconceptions. And therefore it is fundamental in Judaism that one can really connect to the Torah only in a state of humility. Okay, so we've mentioned 3 steps. Leaving Refidim is enthusiasm, passion, and excitement. The first midbar is uncluttering of the mind and simplifying your life by not being so invested in possessions. And the third, which is the second mention of midbar, is humility, humbleness, willingness to learn from every person. Pirkei Avos indeed says, Ezeu Chacham, who is the wise person? Halom made mikol adam, one who learns from everybody. One who says, I can learn from everybody I encounter. Sometimes I'll learn what not to do. That's also a lesson. I can see something negative and say, yeah, that's a good lesson. In fact, what do they say? A wise person learns from other people's mistakes. If you're not so wise, hopefully you'll learn from your mistakes. If you're really bad, you won't even do that. But there are three levels of how that works. By the way, let me go backwards for a moment. I talked about disengaging from possessions. It actually reminds me a little bit. I don't know if they still have this campaign. Pepsi Cola had a campaign for a number of years. It was just called Buy Pepsi, Get Stuff. And that kind of epitomizes the materialistic culture. It doesn't even make a difference what you get. I just want to get stuff. All that matters is that it's stuff. It's like materialism just for materialism. It doesn't give you any pleasure or the like. By the way, in that connection, if I could digress for a moment, there actually was a case because Pepsi Cola had a commercial. I remember when I taught contracts in law school, this was a reported case that was in the law school case books because it's really a very funny case. Pepsi had a commercial because if you had points, you can get prizes. So they said, like for 20 million points, which they computed was impossible, we'll give you a carrier jet, a military jet. And it was a joke commercial, and they actually show a kid in high school who, all the kids are parking their bikes, and this kid comes down in the school parking lot with a military jet. It was fake photography. Now, obviously it was a joke, and they made a number that was so astronomically high that they knew for sure that nobody in the world could ever possibly reach it. But lo and behold, some kid in New York somehow accumulated 20 million points. Maybe a little help with Iran or whatever it would be, and he demanded delivery of a military jet, and he sued Pepsi Cola in federal court for breach of contract because technically an advertisement is an offer which if you accept by complying with the conditions, you actually have created a contract. That's a well-known idea in basic law that advertisements can be contracts when the conditions are activated. So he actually brought a lawsuit in federal court demanding delivery of the jet, or in the alternative, damages which would be equal to the value of the jet, which would be whatever it would be, $30 million or the like. Fascinating case. Now the court dismissed the case. The court said, "Come on, kid, you knew this was a joke." But a lawsuit was actually brought, and one wonders who did he contact to get this? I mean, was there a foreign power involved, or whatever it is? By the way, it is against the law to sell military. Certainly against U.S. law, it's against Israeli law too, to sell military jets to private people. You can't, even if you're rich enough, you can't just buy a military jet to drive around. Okay. All right. Now we come to step number 4. Now step number 4 repeats the verb encamped, right? Step number 3 said Yachanu bamidbar. Step number 4 also uses the verb camping, but it switches from plural to singular. Vayichan. Now, on step number 4, we already have a rabbinic drasha. Because why does it say the Jewish people encamped in the singular? Because this teaches us at Har Sinai, we were ish echad uvalev echad. We were one person, one heart. Achdut, unity. And this is step number 4. You want to receive God's Torah. You have to be united with your fellow Jews in Avat Yisrael. Part of that is because that's the way I learn from each other. And part of it is the Torah was given to the Jewish people. The Torah was not given to individual Jews. When I'm connected to the Jewish people, I'm then connected to God's Torah. We know, of course, how precarious and vulnerable Jewish unity is today on all sorts of levels. It is not only between tensions between religious and secular, which is one level of tension, but tensions, within the religious world, and our people don't speak to each other, and the sinat chinam, and the hatred, the polarization, the indifference, the coldness, the idea that each of us has our clique, has our group, and that's part of why we don't have a Beis HaMikdash yet. That's part of why we don't have Mashiach, because the second temple was destroyed because of this irrational, groundless hatred. And unfortunately, as the Talmud Yerushalmi says, in every generation that the Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt, we are guilty of the same sin that caused its churban. So that's unity. So our 4-step plan is very simple. Passion, simplicity, humility, and unity. Write it on a card, and we have our mission statement. And that is how we accept God's Torah, by following those 4 steps. And that is the purpose of the second pasuk, not to repeat the geographical journey of the Jews, but to indicate their spiritual journey. Now, let me mention a parallel story in the Gemara and actually link it to the Orach Chaim, although he does not make the connection. One of the most famous stories in the Talmud, a story which is enormously important philosophically to understand the legal structure of the Torah, is the famous story of Tanur Shel Achnai. Tanur Shel Achnai literally means the snake-like oven. And this was a technical debate about an earthenware oven that would be transported by cutting it into horizontal hoops. Imagine a lot of hula hoops, if you remember what hula hoops were. So they would have an earthenware oven, but in order to transport it, it would be cut into hoops, and they would carry the hoops, and whenever they had to reassemble it, they would put mud in between the hoops, and when it dried out, they had an oven. They can then get rid of the mud and then transport the earthenware hoops. So it's called Tanur Shel Achnai simply because it resembled a coiled snake. A snake whose tail is in its mouth, so coiled. So there's a machlokas, an argument in the Gemara. Does such an oven, is it susceptible to ritual impurity? Because normally, if dead animals or dead people come in contact with vessels, they become impure, but only if the vessels are functional, not if they're broken. So, for example, if you have a broken vessel, it does not become tameh. So the question is whether these hoops were considered broken, or that was the way they were transported and they were considered functional. Machlokas. Most of the sages took the position that the oven is susceptible to tumah. Rabbi Eliezer took the position that it is pure. And although he was overruled by the majority, he refused to concede the point. He brought all sorts of arguments, they were rejected, but he said he's right. So, since he could not convince the sages on the underlying dispute, he started invoking supernatural means to prove his point. And he said, if the halacha is like me, let the carob tree uproot itself and fly away. And the carob tree uprooted itself and flew away. And the Chachamim, the sages, responded, we don't listen to carob trees. Okay. If the halacha is like me, let the river reverse its course and move upstream. And the river reversed its course. A miracle. And the sages said, sorry, we don't listen to rivers either. Trees don't prove the point, and rivers don't prove the point. So then he said, if the halacha is like me, let the walls of this study hall collapse inwards. And the walls began to collapse inwards. And Rabbi Yehoshua stood up and told the walls, don't you dare move. So the walls didn't know who to listen to. Rabbi Eliezer ordered them to move. Rabbi Yeshua ordered them to straighten out. So because of that, the walls remain slanting, the Talmud says, until this very day. That's kind of explaining the architecture of a Beis Medrash that was out of whack. Again, you could guess the answer. We don't listen to walls. Trees don't prove you're right, and water doesn't prove you're right, and walls don't prove you're right. So finally, he invokes the big guns. He says, if the halacha is like me, let there be a voice from heaven. God! Let God declare that I'm right. This is called a bas kol. And a voice from heaven, God, declared Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And the Chachamim said to God, we don't care what you say either, because you said in your Torah, the Torah is not in heaven. You gave us the responsibility to interpret the Torah. And once you gave us that responsibility, you do not have a say in the process anymore. Talk about nobody is above the law, right? We say that wrong. Nobody is above the law. God has to follow those rules too. Wow. So, now you think that's pretty arrogant, but in point of fact, it mentions that somebody met Elijah, the prophet, and asked him, what was God's response when they said, stay out of it? And he says, oh, God was laughing, and God said, my children have been victorious over me, I'm going to stay out of this fight. Now, this itself is a remarkable, remarkable story, and one could spend almost a lifetime pondering the implications. Because after all, I mean, think about this way. If the goal of halachic determination is to try to figure out what the will of God is in any given case, and good, we don't have direct revelation, so we do precedent, we do analogy, we do analysis, but ultimately we're trying to figure out the will of God. How can the will of God be irrelevant in that process? It's like, I'll give you a trivial example. It's like kids are debating what they want to get their father for a birthday present. So they're sitting around, no, I think Dad likes this, I think Dad likes this. And Abba walks by and says, well, you know, what I really like is this, something. So they say to the father, please Dad, stay out of this. You have nothing to do with this discussion. I mean, we're discussing what your father wants, so your father's desire is not relevant to that determination. Now, halacha is apparently the same thing. What does God want us to do in a given situation? And normally we don't have direct divine input, so we got to try to guess. Okay, that's fine. But if God tells you what he wants, how can you dismiss that as irrelevant to the process? Now, you might say, well, who says it was a genuine voice? All sorts of people either hear voices or make up voices. That's a possibility, but that is not at all what the Talmud seems to be saying. The Talmud is not suggesting the inauthenticity of the voice. The Talmud is suggesting that even if the voice is 100% authentic, it does not enter into the halachic determination. And essentially, the way this is explained, this is not the major topic I'm going to address, but it's such an important idea that I'm going to mention something that's secondary to the story, but connected to our Orach Chaim. But the primary message here is that although God does have an objective truth, And on an objective mathematical level, let's say, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. But God also has an operational truth. That is the way we are supposed to live on this earth. And he wants the operational truth to come through human reasoning and input. So God might say, Rabbi Eliezer is right and you guys are wrong, but you guys have the authority to determine how my will is to be implemented on earth, because the Torah is a partnership between man and God. And it's as if a teacher says to a student, I give you full credit for process, meaning to say, even if you got the wrong answer, I will bless it as what I want to be done on earth, because it came through your reasoning, your effort, your attempt to ascertain the divine will. Meaning there is higher truth and earthly truth, there is objective truth and operational truth, there is substance truth and process truth. Very, very complicated idea. And that's kind of how the halachic process works. It's actually reminiscent a little bit, lahavdil, of a famous statement made by the great Supreme Court Justice and Nuremberg prosecutor Robert Jackson, who said about the United States Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is not final because it is infallible, but it is infallible because it's final. Meaning to say, the Supreme Court might say something is totally wrong, but definitionally they are the final word. So halacha creates a system where even if the end result might be wrong in some sense, that is the system God wants us to follow. So it becomes infallible by virtue of the system, not because objectively it is true. Okay, again, this is very, very profound. It has many, many implications. It is actually not the point I want to talk about. I want to talk about almost the side point. And the side point is a comment of the Vilna Gaon, who simply discusses what is the significance of the three miracles Rabbi Eliezer does before he hits the Baskol. Miracle 1 was the uprooting of the carob tree. Miracle 2 was the reversal of the course of the river. And miracle 3 were the walls of the Beit HaMidrash. So here is what the Vilna Gaon says. The Vilna Gaon has a list of 3 qualities that one needs to be successful in Torah learning. Quality number 1, and you'll see this overlaps with the Orach Chaim, but it's a little different. Quality number 1 is simplicity of lifestyle and disengagement with material possessions. That is signified by the carob tree. The carob is very, very simple food that generations of American day school students used to eat this dried carob on Tu B'Shvat. It was absolutely awful. It broke your teeth. But Chazal talk about the great righteous people subsist only on plain dried carob. So Rabbi Eliezer is basically telling the Chachamim, listen to me, because I am a person who lives the most simple of life, as the carob tree can attest. As he's using nature to testify as to his spiritual attributes. The second quality is humility, which is signified by water. In the Orach Chaim analysis it was desert, but the water, because water goes from high ground to low ground, and he says, listen to me, because the water can attest to my humility. Now, you might stop there and say, wait a second, that's a little odd. I'm telling you, I am so humble, I will make a miracle to change the course of nature so that water will reverse its course. That doesn't seem to be characteristic of a humble person. But in reality, that's not a contradiction. Because true humility doesn't mean you think you're a nobody, but it means you recognize that you have gifts, but those gifts came from God. So a person can legitimately say, if he means it, that I am a humble person. I'm not doing this for egotism. I'm not doing this for arrogance. I am not doing it to show that I'm better than you. I'm doing it because objectively I believe this is right, and the water can testify that I have that characteristic of humility. So the carob tree matches up with the first desert in the Orach Chaim's analysis, simplicity. The water matches up with the second desert in the Archives analysis, humility. Now, the third quality, this is the Vilna Gaon's list, is one of diligence. The Beit HaMidrash, you got to put in time. Even if you live a simple life, even if you're modest, if you don't put in the time, the hasmadah, to learn Torah, you're not going to know it. That corresponds with passion. Because when you're passionate about something, you lose track of the time. Right? One of the most wonderful experiences in life, it doesn't happen that often for many people, is when you're so engrossed in something that the time just flies. That's a tremendous feeling. You're kind of in the zone, I think is the expression they use, or in the moment. You're just flowing. You can go for hours without eating, without drinking, nothing even bothers you. That's a wonderful, wonderful feeling of being connected. Again, hopefully it would be in learning, but people can have those experiences in other things as well. They lose themselves in it. So the ability to spend long hours is really connected to passion. Because when you don't have passion, you're not going to be able to do it. I mean, after 5 minutes, you're going to get restless. So the point I want to make is that the Vilna Gaon's three qualities that Rabbi Eliezer is showing that he has do match up with 3 out of the 4 of the Orach Chaim's qualities. And just to give you the list here. Again, the passion matches up to the walls of the Beis Medrash, which is diligence. The first midbar, which is simplicity, matches up to the carob tree. The second midbar, which is humility, matches up to the water. So Rabbi Eliezer is trying to demonstrate he has 3 of the qualities that a Talmid Chacham must have. But what's interesting is he is missing one thing. He is missing quality number 4, unity, because he's unwilling to accommodate the views of others. So it's interesting that perhaps, I shouldn't say failing, but perhaps the one thing that caused his words not to be accepted was the inability to compromise and create unity. So the Vilna Gaon's list of 3, I would submit, matches up with 3 out of the 4 of the Or HaChaim, but Rabbi Eliezer fails in the quality of unity. By the way, just to finish the story, sorry?
In terms of the process, right?
Yeah.
You said the Torah is not in heaven,
Yeah.
but another part of the process is going after the road. I know you didn't focus on that, but that's really fits in the whole unity
Yes.
process.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. Going after the majority, that's 100% correct. That's part of the unity, deferring to the process. Now, I just want to mention that the end of the story is not so pleasant, and that is because Rabbi Eliezer refused Sanhedrin, his own brother-in-law, Rabbi Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, excommunicated him. He put him in Cherem, which means he was no longer allowed to teach Torah. He was no longer allowed to have students. And Rabbi Akiva, who was his disciple, was instructed to communicate to Rabbi Eliezer that message. And Rabbi Akiva enters Rabbi Eliezer's room. Rabbi Eliezer is sick in bed, and he stands at a distance of 4 cubits from him. And Rabbi Eliezer says, why are you standing so far away? And Rabbi Akiva said, it appears that your colleagues have separated themselves from you. And Rabbi Eliezer began to sob, because he said, I am like a Torah scroll that's totally wrapped up tight. There is so much to give, and I cannot give anymore. And it mentions that Rabbi Eliezer's wife, who was Rabbi Gamliel's sister, never let her husband say the Tachanun prayer. Because the Tachanun prayer is when you express your anguish to God. And she was afraid if he would express his anguish to God, God would punish Rabbi Gamliel for causing that anguish. But one day she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, where you don't say Tachanun, so she wasn't interrupting him. And it was not Rosh Chodesh. And she comes in and she sees that he's saying Tachanun. He said to him, you killed my brother today. And at that very moment, Rabbi Gamliel died. She got word that Rabbi Gamliel died exactly. Now again, I do not understand the story that Rabbi Eliezer was praying for the death of Rabban Gamliel. I do not understand the story that way at all, but it's simply more of a deeper idea, that by expressing his anguish, God intervenes. Now this again, there's so many fascinating issues here, because one might argue, why should Rabban Gamliel be punished for this at all? He did the right thing. He needed to establish the institution of the Sanhedrin. So this gets us into the very interesting thing, that just because you did something that was morally correct does not remove the traces. There is what philosophers call moral traces. Even in virtuous action, there are negative consequences that have real consequences. Sometimes you do a virtuous action, but it causes pain, it causes suffering. There is no total defense in the fact that I needed to do what I needed to do, because there's kind of like a cosmic law of the universe, that the pain that you cause people comes back to bite you. An analogy might be jumping into a fire. If I jump into a fire to save a baby, I did the right thing, I did a good thing, I did a virtuous thing. But that's not an insurance policy that you're not going to be badly burnt, because it is a consequence of nature that fire is going to burn you. Once in a while, God may do some supernatural miracle, but that is not the normal way things operate. And you can't say, but I did the right thing. You did the right thing, but you were playing with fire. So, in a way that's less easy for us to understand. Like that example is, we could readily grasp. But that's also true in the realm of morality. People may do what they need to do, but there's still going to be some accountability for the pain and the suffering that was caused, which really puts you in a no-win situation, quite literally. There's no way you can get out of it. You're going to get burnt one way or the other. You do the right thing. And this is the way I understand the Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer story. I do not understand the story that Rabbi Eliezer was praying for the death of Rabban Gamliel. But rather, as he expresses his anguish, Rabban Gamliel is going to be called to account for it. Okay, anyway, be well, have a wonderful week, and Mr. Hashem will see you next week.
It's